Welcome everyone to our innovative session on disrupting and unsettling white supremacist regimes of colonial power, a transnational dialogical reflection on Indigenous, Black, and racial justice praxes. My name is Jesica Siham Fernández, and I am joined today by fellow presenters and panelists, Leigh, Rauk, Daniela, Miranda, Beals, and Rama Agung-Igusti. I am honored and grateful for their presence as they will be joining us in reflecting upon their work, their writings, and their scholarship as it relates to the ways in which they unsettle and disrupt white supremacist ideologies rooted in what Aníbal Quijano describes as the coloniality of power. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which I stand. I am an uninvited occupant in the land that rightfully belongs to the Ohlone and Mi'kmaq Ohlone people that are the protectors and holders of the Silicon Valley region here in the West Coast of the US in California, where I am an uninvited occupant working to decolonize the university and my ways of knowing, relating, and being. I will now say a little bit about our presenters and our panelists who are joining me today. Leigh Rauk is a PhD candidate at the University of Miami, and she contributed to the special issue on the Global Journal of Community Psychology Praxes that the Council on Cultural, Ethnic, and Racial Affairs edited that centered on the themes of racial justice and an anti-racist praxis. All of the presenters today have contributed valuable papers to this special issue. The special issue sought to engage in a conversation around the various ways in which Black, Indigenous, people of color, and white allies are engaging in the disruption and unsettling of whiteness and white supremacy, and to describe the various ways in which they approach this work through their research, teaching, pedagogy, and praxis. This special issue has been a work of love and resistance to the various ways in which each of these contributors unsettle white supremacy within the discipline of community psychology, centering in particular about the various intersections of this kind of work. And so Leigh is a PhD candidate at the University of Miami, as I just mentioned, and she recently defended her dissertation, so congratulations to her. She is a community engaged scholar who has spent the past 3 years collaborating with Black-led grassroots organizations in Miami, focused on developing the leadership of Black, Brown young people to organize around issues of school policing, safety, and civic engagement. Through collaboration and a transformative paradigm, she strives to stand in solidarity with community partners to expose, subvert, and challenge injustices to cultivate healthy and just communities. Beals is a two-spirit Indigenous Black Ulnu, a mixed Black, African, Nova Scotian, and First Nation Mi'kmaq from the territory of Mi'kmaq. Anna-Marie is a graduate student at Wilfrid Laurier University and a story sharer working on the ProclaimingOurRoots.com project. Stories from this project revolve around Afro-Indigenous identity and relationships with Indigenous and Black communities. Their research explores the health and well-being of their communities and looking at the effects of colonial legacies of oppression and violence and lack of acknowledgement of Indigenous Black identity in the settler nation state known as Canada. Anna-Marie shares Afro-Indigenous voices in uplifting the sacred stories of strength, self-assertion, and consciousness raising through the lived experiences and knowledges loudly resonating in Indigenous Black communities. And Daniela Miranda is a PhD candidate at the University of Sevilla and actively involved in various research projects at the Center of Community Research and Action. Her interests include civic engagement, community-based participatory action research, intersectional health equity, and reproductive justice. Over the past 6 years, she has worked alongside Roma women and girls in grassroots organizations through projects financed by the International Organization for Immigration's Open Society Foundation and the European Union. Through this work, she has carried out her dissertation, A Meaningful Community Advocacy Framework for Roma Health Justice. In 2020, she co-founded the grassroots organization, Her Flowers, which aims to build the foundations of an anti-racism youth organizing ethic with teenage girls across the US. And lastly, Rama Agung-Igusti was born in the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kundaling Nation in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, to white settler and Balinese migrant parents. He is a PhD candidate at Victoria University, and his thesis project sits within the area of critical community psychology and further draws from decolonial, post-colonial, Black feminist, and critical race and whiteness theories. He is interested in the ways individuals and communities respond to and resist racialization, structural and institutional racism, and how identity and belonging is negotiated in the context of Australia as a settler colonial nation, and creative practices that mobilize for social change and radical imagination that unsettle ways of knowing and being. And so I'm quite happy and honored to be joined by these four panelists. Leigh's paper to the special issue was titled Getting to the Heart of It, a reflection on the importance of community psychologists developing an anti-racist praxis. Anna Marie Beals' paper was titled Resisting the Coloniality and Colonialism of a Westernized Community Psychology Towards a Critical Racial Justice Praxis. Daniela Miranda's paper was titled A Photo Voice Project for Ethnic Health Justice, Reflections from Roma Communities in Seville, Spain. And Rama's paper was titled Color Between the Lines, Self-Determination and the Creation of Settings as Resistance to Structural Violence. Based on these titles and based on the biographies, scholarly biographies of these scholars and panelists, it is clear that their work strives to unsettle and disrupt these white supremacist regimes. And in light of these themes and these conversations and their powerful contributions to the special issue, which is forthcoming in the Journal of Global Community Psychology Practice, we are gathered today to center on these 4 questions. We may address all 4 of them, we may address some of them, but we invite you, viewer, guest, participant in this gathering to join us in this conversation and to reflect on these questions as we are gathered together to reflect on them as well. And so with that, I will now transition on to sharing our panelists and engaging in a reflexive dialogical conversation about these themes. So welcome. So shall we begin with the first question? I will be moderating and facilitating our conversation. But the first question that I want to share with all of you and pose to you is, how does racism, racialization, whiteness, and colonial power surface in your work? Specifically, the research or scholarship featured in the manuscript that you contributed to this special issue.
I can go ahead and start. Thank you, Jessica. And I'm so grateful to be with all of you and learn from what we have in common and what we can learn from each other. And well, for the first question, one of the things, well, all of the 4 questions together, what I really liked, it made me go into a very personal reflection about my place and how the work that I've done. So I'm actually originally from the US. I'm white Latina. My mom is Venezuelan. My dad is Cuban. I was born in Puerto Rico, grew up most of my life in the US. And when I arrived in Spain to do my graduate studies, I knew very little about Roma communities, the largest ethnic or ethnicized community in Europe. And while I was in the university, being an English speaker, what I noticed was that, of course, like a lot of my colleagues weren't speaking this dominant language. And I had this huge privilege over my colleagues who had been doing the work for many years. And so from one part of it, I had this like quick access and visibility to a lot of things, but yet not knowing anything about the communities I was starting to collaborate with. And so when I arrived in Sevilla, I started working with the whole Photo Voice, with these wonderful Roma women and girls that are now family, colleagues, and everything. And as I was living here, I was learning so many stereotype dominant ideas about Roma women, especially from white European perspective. But at the same time, I was learning so much about their narrative through the Photo Voice. That was actually what this paper was about. So at the same time, I was going through this construction and deconstruction all in parallel at the same time. So it showed up like the colonial aspect of this dominant language. At the same time, the racialization, the whiteness, like all showed up at such a crossroads for me.
And I would assume gender as well, right? In terms of how Roma women are constructed in the context of Spain.
And the similarities I felt as a Latina woman in the US, how connected I felt to the Roma women here compared to the white European women colleagues that I had. So there was like so many layers to my identities, the communities, my colleagues throughout the Photo Voice process.
Thank you, Daniela. It seems like these intersections are threads that were also present in the papers by Anna Marie, Rama, and Leigh as well, right? This process of reflection. I know, Leigh, your paper was also very much a reflexive piece.
Yeah. I mean, I think the major component of my paper was about being really reflexive. And as a white woman working with a Black-led organization in Miami for the past 3 years, as I began to engage with this organization, I really wanted to do that in an accountable way and recognize my own identity in that work. And so, realizing that I had to be really reflexive about who I am and where I come from and how my own experiences don't necessarily relate to the experiences of the young people that I was working with, particularly around policing in schools and, arrest rates in schools and feelings of unsafety for them at school was just very different from my own experience when I was in high school. And I realized that in my community psychology classes, I really wasn't getting that reflection piece of it. I was sort of being trained to be a researcher, to go into communities and give voice to communities. And I had a lot of problems with that. And I felt sort of uncomfortable that I, a white woman, was trying to give voice to these Black and brown young people. And what did that mean? And what is the power that I hold as a white woman in that space? And so actually began engaging with some community organizations that really helped me kind of unpack some of those things and understand what an anti-racist practice looks like, and understanding that I'm at the very beginning of that journey, but just really trying to be intentional about that, and also have accountable relationships, not only to the organization, but to other community members who could help me in that process and also hold me accountable to that practice and kind of what that looks like. And that's very much ongoing. But I felt like it was really important for me to engage in this relationship with this community organization in an ethical way. Yeah.
Thank you, Leigh. And you mentioned the ways in which you were being trained as a community psychologist, and the absences, the explicit and obvious absences of centering critical race theories and perspectives within the canon of community psychology, which is part of what Anna Marie features in that co-authored manuscript around the limitations of our discipline in not including the scholarship and the work of Black and Indigenous and communities of color. And Anna-Marie, would you like to offer some reflections on the ways in which the history of psychology continues to be this reproduction of whiteness and coloniality in a very oppressive and violent way? I'm sure you have so much to say on that.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, I probably could talk for quite a while, but I would like to acknowledge, though, that I did not write this paper by myself. I am a graduate student, and so I was very honored to live in the mentorship of you, Jessica, and Cian Wilson, and Jerry Palmer, and Dominique Thomas, and bringing this paper together. So, you know, when we're talking about what it's like in the institution and academy, the actual writing of this paper was a resistance to the coloniality that we find in our institutions. And I guess I could say that I'm fairly lucky where I am in Wilfrid Laurier, in that we have instructors, professors who are critical who are now critical in their outlooks of who we bring in, who is part of the canon, in reproducing and not reproducing what I experienced in my undergrad, where ironically we're talking in June of 2021, where when I wanted to use critical race theory as the theoretical perspective of a paper that I was writing, and within the positive paradigm of the university, it was all stroked out in big red pen strokes, and so that was not part of what I was learning or what I wanted to learn. I yearned to learn more about how people are resisting, and how we can actually move the academy in a way that serves those who are systemically marginalized, Indigenous and Black students and faculty. But you know, what do we really expect from an institution that was actually born from the Colonial project? Why would it not replicate the ways and the strategies of how colonialism via white supremacy came to be? If we think that the academy is somehow, and especially community psychology, is somehow dissociated from the larger colonial project in which we live on Turtle Island, in both the settler nation states of Canada and the US, we're being naive. If we think that the institution was designed to serve the settler project, then again, we are being naive. And so I feel really blessed and honored to be able to write in resistance to that, and what that means for Black and Indigenous students of color and faculty and staff, because no one is exempt from the oppression, no one is exempt from the racism. Yeah, and in future thinking, what does that look like? Because are we going to maintain the status quo? No, because that's not going to work. So what does that look like? And I think we're going to talk about that in the future in our session here. But yeah, in my own project, Proclaiming Our Roots with Cian Wilson and Denise Baldwin, who came up with the concept of understanding what it means to be Indigenous, Black, mixed blood in the settler nation state of Canada, and the erasure of who we are, and the double oppressions that we face as being marginalized by white supremacy, being oppressed by white supremacy, and the intergenerational traumas of so much that is going on, that has been going on for 400 years. It's a lot. So that's why I came to community psychology, to try to find a place where I could learn from radical and critical scholars and activists, community members that are working in our communities for the betterment of our communities. And so it is in a colonial institution, it is a colonial program, but that doesn't mean that we cannot do the work that we need to do for our people. I think I'll just do that there.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.
It's true. Even within these systems and structures that are inherently oppressive, we find ways of resisting and ways of, in relationship to Rama's work, creating settings that resist the structural violence, that allow for self and collective determination, for healing, for thriving. So Rama, tell us a little bit about your work and your contributions. And it seems to really speak to what Anne-Marie was just mentioning.
Yeah, I think as everyone's been speaking, I started at the beginning when we all met thinking, God, what am I going to say? And then as everyone started sharing some of their work, I'm like, oh yeah, that connects into something that I was doing, which is, really, really nice. With the work I've been doing, I've been lucky enough to work with a collective of creative artists from the African diaspora here in Australia, who've been creating settings that they can, have critical conversations, to self-determine over their stories, and also just to have create opportunities and pull in resources that can serve their communities. And part of my role has been working collaboratively with them to sort of document this process and document these things. And it's been interesting because a big part of that has been looking at their relationships with other organizations, so not-for-profits, local government, of other kinds of settings, and looking at the kinds of ways that they, those kinds of relationships can also constrain some of, their ways of working towards self-determination. And I think as I was sort of thinking about this sort of question, something that really rung true for me is some of the ways that it was easy when focusing on those relationships to sometimes not so much focus on my own relationship as being part of the academy, being a researcher, and the ways that my relationship could also constrain some of that self-determination and those things as well. And so I think I've reflected a lot as well on what it means to be a researcher in a university setting, and at what point so I think sometimes we can kind of gaslight ourselves into thinking that perhaps the things that we do might have more value. That's to say it doesn't, but I think sometimes we can do that, and to sort of gaslight ourselves into saying that there's maybe more value in the things that we're doing for different groups and communities. And I think really being reflective about that and thinking, what's needed, what's important, what do people desire, and what. I think as well, Leigh, when you were speaking, there was a conversation I had with my partner the other day. And I don't know if anyone's seen the movie Save the Last Dance with Julia Stiles. I don't know, so it was. I remember growing up, it was one of my favorite flicks. But it's basically, about a white woman. Basically, it's really just about a white woman with a black community around her that are just kind of props in her own personal development and her own personal story. And so we're talking about this sort of idea of Save the Last Dance syndrome and the dangers of sometimes postgraduate research or any kind of research, turning you into a bit of a Julia Stiles character, where you've just got different communities and community members around you in your own story of personal development or professional development or becoming an agent of the academy. And so anyway, that was a useful thing for me to sort of think about some of those things. But also acknowledging that in the academy we can shift resources, create spaces, and have an opportunity to shift things. But I guess sometimes just being careful about some of the things that we tell ourselves as well.
Thank you, Rama. The mentioning of dance really took me to originally Daniela's comment and the kind of metaphor for the kind of dancing that sometimes we have to do within the academy to subvert and resist, at the same time that we remain critical about our positionalities, both how we position ourselves, how we are positioned by the institution, how our communities are simultaneously positioned as well. And then how do you subvert, how do you resist? And then how do you, in the words of Audre Lorde, dismantle the master's house by retooling or reinventing and reappropriating the tools that have been used against our communities, but now you're shifting them to transform communities and then upend the academy or the institutions. So in thinking about this kind of metaphor of the dancing that we do, in the spirit of what Anzaldúa describes, a spiritual activism, right, of resistance and subverting, I'm going to turn to our second question, which is, how do you engage in disrupting and unsettling racism, whiteness, and colonial power through your praxis, whether that be through your teaching, through your pedagogy, through your writing, through your art, through your activism, through your community engagement? What are some reflections of the ways in which you approach this process of unsettling and disruption? And also of transformation and of healing as well.
Maybe I'll go, because I just wanted to say that one of my most favorite white savior movies, just to go on with the theme, is that one with Michelle Pfeiffer, and she's the teacher in the Black community. I don't even remember the name of it, but I remember her. And I was like, oh my. So yeah, disrupting all of that would be good. But I think that a way to be disruptive, in a sense, it's not even being disruptive. I think it's just being respectful, and just thinking of the teachings of some of the Indigenous scholars that I've had the honor to read, like Sean Wilson, for instance, and talking about what research looks like in our communities, and thinking about, it has been through my experience and through my readings that for somehow research in the academy is, we understand what's best for communities, and we're just going to go in and tell them what it is that we think you should do. And so in my learnings, I understand that, again, with the white savior complex and having researchers build their careers off the backs of Black and Indigenous communities of color, stop doing that. Look at communities and understand and ask, what do you need? What do you want? What do you desire? Without going in and thinking that, we're the experts in everything and we know everything. I think of the work of SCRA, which I was fortunate to be taught in my program, and the dialectical learning, because it is a learning process for everyone. At least it's been in my experience in a community-based research kind of practice, in that we are not the experts, and we can learn a lot from the community members with whom we work. And it's a beautiful thing. We don't have to be the experts. We don't have to be the leaders. Community members know what they want and what they need, and are definitely a part of the process of what it looks like. And with the Proclaiming Our Roots project, when we had workshops in Toronto and in Halifax, they were gatherings. We had elders who opened and supported. It was called Research in the Academy, but it was really gatherings and conversations and uplifting of who we are and what it looks like to move forward as Indigenous Black people, as Afro-Indigenous people. What does it look like moving forward in the settler nation state? And in raising a critical consciousness and sharing that across the land. So I consider that to be a form of resistance to the academy and what our research can look like. It cannot be this, I know and you don't know, and I know what's best and you don't know what's best. The white man comes into our communities and tries to shove his form of medicine down our throats. And it tastes awful and it's bitter. And we don't like it and we're not taking it. We have our own medicines. We've had our own medicines from the elders and the knowledge keepers for thousands of years. And we know what we need, and what we need is the dismantling of white supremacy and the taking the yokes off and the oppression. We need to be able to have self-determination on our lands, give us back our lands, and sovereignty, and stop telling us what we need, because we know what we need. We just need to be rid of you. And so we use our research in a way to actually promote that agenda, because honestly, if white supremacy is not dismantled, if colonialism, capitalism, racism, if we continue to operate in this kind of society, I think we know how it will continue to turn out, and the 7 generations to come will continue to suffer as we suffer today.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So part of what you're describing is acknowledging the power, the knowledge, and the wisdom that communities already hold, and the necessity for professionals, for community psychologists to extend and go beyond this notion of humility, but to really recognize themselves as not the holders of solutions, or to really not fall under the assumption that we are saviors, or that we are there to quote unquote fix communities, but on the contrary, that communities are such holders of knowledge, power, and healing to really resist this notion of empowerment and what that means, right? In my own work, I intentionally don't use the word empowerment, because communities themselves already have power. And I think that these are examples that are reflected in each of your work, with Roma communities, with Black youth in schools, with the African diaspora in Australia. And so I really appreciate you, Anne-Marie, calling that out and naming it explicit, that we should never fall under the assumption that we are somehow doing communities a favor. Right? Other reflections of the ways in which you all approach your work in terms of unsettling whiteness and power?
I just wanted to, if you just drop something in there as well, just off sort of what Anne-Marie and Jessica you just shared as well. And I think something I've been thinking about a bit is in that sort of sense of communities having power, and just the way, I don't know, just sort of something that I've seen played out, not only in my project, but in other spaces as well, where there's these kinds of forms of power and resources that different communities have that either aren't acknowledged or valued, or are told that those things aren't worth anything, but are taken anyway and then turned into something that has value in another setting. And so that's just something I've been sort of seeing. So when you do when communities or for in the instance of my work, the collective are collaborating with different groups or organizations, I think there's this sort of one size fits all view of collaboration and partnership that conveniently doesn't necessarily see accurately the kinds of flows of power and resource that happens in that partnership, or the kinds of labor that gets done that don't get accounted for. So, whether that's around, creating spaces that are culturally safe, or basically, or just, educating people on things like whiteness and white supremacy, or whatever it may be, don't get tallied up in the kinds of, accountings that happen when you sit down and have a project with another group or a different group of people. So I don't know, I think I think that's just something I've been thinking a lot more about is how do we suddenly start to account for those things, those kinds of labors. If you've got timesheets that are accounting for hours, how do you say what kind of hours have been put into educating other folks? Anyway, I thought that's sort of something that resonated with me from what you were both sharing.
That's bringing up for me a recent experience of, I think what Anne-Marie was saying, it's that acknowledgement of knowledge, but then as a non-Roma, for me, something that comes as comes up is, how do I honor the knowledge that communities are sharing with me in a lot of spaces where, if I, for example, last week I had a meeting with all English speaking from different countries, and I was presenting the work that we had done here. And I think that that's something as community psychologists, we have to honor and make sure that every part of the process is just like being reviewed time and time again, because it's such an honor and responsibility to be the one sharing that. And sometimes there's no options. For example, some projects don't give us money for interpreters. And so we can't have, so what do? You do it to the best of your ability to make sure you're honoring the knowledge that communities are sharing with you. But it's something that still doesn't feel right to me. I feel like I have to do it because I'm giving the space to do it, but I'm not anybody's voice, if that makes sense. And so that's something I feel like institutions that are, funding our projects or supporting work still are missing those tools and gaps to really make sure that I don't need to be talking for anybody, if that makes sense. So it's something that still comes up for me.
Thank you, Daniela. It seems like you've gotten us into the third question with how it feels to do this kind of work, with how it sits in our body, how it feels, what it looks like. And so I'll pose our third question, which is, what does Indigenous self-determination, anti-Black racism, and racial justice mean, feel, and look like to you and in relationship to your work? And you clearly described the feeling of unsettledness that comes with the privilege of having to present in English the work that is by Roma people, for Roma people, and yet these institutions and organizations don't create spaces or funding opportunities for Roma people to be the ones to speak on the issues and the work and the scholarship and the projects that they carry forward. And so it's interesting how sometimes in our work, the academy positions us as interlocutors or as speakers for. And so how can we subvert that? And then how does it feel and where does it sit? And so how do we engage in these subversive ways of unsettling all of that in our work? So I don't know if there are additional reflections on that. Leigh, I'm sure you have a lot to share based on your piece being a reflexive piece of your own work and your own positionalities.
Yeah, I really appreciate what everybody has shared so far. I feel like I'm learning through this process too, which I think is just so great, of being able to have these conversations. Yeah, in terms of how it feels, I think about that a lot, and speaking to the last question just a little bit, in my work with this community organization, I really do my best to follow their leadership, and that probably doesn't always happen perfectly as I'm navigating my own sort of complicity in white supremacy systems and still navigating and understanding that, but really trying to follow in their leadership and not only being a researcher in this space, but also being a participant in a lot of ways. So that looks like canvassing with the young people, making phone calls, speaking at school board meetings. And, a lot of times, a lot of feelings come up around that, of like, just feelings of like fear and uncomfortableness as like I'm stepping outside of my own, what I feel like I'm capable of doing, or, feeling like very afraid to speak at school board meetings because it's a very intimidating thing, but also recognizing that I'm there supporting young people who also feel a similar way. And we're kind of there together in this experience. And at the end, it feels very energizing and exciting that I was able to be part of that space with them, and just feeling really grateful that they allow me to enter those spaces with them, to be a participant in those spaces. And then just reflecting on my own whiteness and privilege, just feelings of sadness and anger and fear and even defensiveness sometimes is like, when people mention something that I maybe did that caused harm, and feeling a little defensive about that, but then also having to recognize that, I may not be seeing all of these things, and having to, I think in another session I was in at the international conference, somebody had mentioned that if somebody is trying to hold you accountable, that means that they see that you are capable of doing better. And so recognizing that those conversations around accountability, while they can be uncomfortable or different feelings come up around that, because you feel bad that you've harmed somebody, but also recognizing that if they're telling you, that means that you can do better and they're providing you that space and opportunity to try to fix the harm in some way, but also move forward in that relationship and do better in the next conversation or in the next space. So yeah, I think there's a lot of feelings around just recognizing my own whiteness in that space, but I think there's also positive feelings of just being really grateful, feeling really energized by the work, and just really appreciative of being able to learn from these young people and being able to be in that space with them. And yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned accountability and approaching accountability from a standpoint of transformation and of relationality, radical relationality, as opposed to accountability from a place of punishment and policing, because sometimes accountability can be framed as you've done harm, and so now we are going to hold you accountable in some kind of punishable, hegemonic, oppressive, power-like way. But the accountability that you're describing is one really about repair, renewal, and the restoring of a relationship and the possibilities for that growth. And so the strategies that you shared are very, very valuable. And so I'll bring us into our last question, and I'll reframe it a little bit just so that those that are joining us and are viewing this video, this conversation, can take away some words of wisdom from all that you've shared, taking into account that you're all, budding, emerging, the current and next generation of community psychologists. I'm affirmed in seeing the ways in which you're all thinking and approaching this work, to see how our discipline is going to shift and change and be transformed based on the conversations and the work that you're all engaged in. And so the last question, I'll reframe it a little bit to ask, what would be some words of wisdom, some consejos or advice, tools or mechanisms, or what Adrienne Mayer Brown calls emergent strategies for approaching anti-racist work? How do you approach this? How do you do it? What would you say to those that are viewing this conversation in terms of guiding their work towards an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, racial justice praxis, so racial freedom, racial equity, transformation? I know it's a big question, but I'm sure you all have some affirmations that guide your work of sorts, right? Or your favorite quote.
It is a big question, Jesica. We find ourselves again in 2021 asking the question, which in itself is telling. I really feel that that regardless of what we do with our work, we should be looking at the systems of oppression and how they manifest in the communities that we work with. I know that in the US right now, critical race theory is under attack. From what I read, people don't even know what critical race theory is, but nonetheless, it is one of the theoretical perspectives that I use in my work, which invariably allows for a power analysis, as to why it is that our people, for me, Indigenous Black people, are still under the yoke of white supremacy. So I feel that as a form of resistance to the status quo, that regardless of what we do, we should always be thinking about that power and how it affects us and what we can do to usurp that power in everything that we do. And I think another part of that is in working with our communities is that understanding that regardless of what perspective we come from, we can't just assume that we're always an insider researcher and that community members will just welcome us with open arms just because of who we represent. One way that we will change, we will have transformative change, is by uplifting our community members in a sense that, as you mentioned, Jessica, it's not about empowerment, it's about doing what we need to do. So coming to our communities from a good place, and understanding reciprocity, and these are some of the things I've learned from Sean Wilson, and reciprocity, and that we repair the imbalance brought by colonization, by usurping and dismantling colonization. We're reflective and thinking about those structures of privilege, the hegemony that we have right now in Turtle Island, and we recenter those who have the knowledge keepers, the elders. We reimagine what we can be, who we can be in this society, and we build those relationships to promote that, and we are held accountable. That's really is key. So I guess I see it as a kind of a two-pronged approach, whereas we analyze the power, we understand the power, we work to dismantle the power, but we work with our community, we work with our grassroots organizations in achieving that as well for the benefit of all members of our community. But at least here in Canada, the settler nation states of Canada and the US and other places around the world that suffer under the yokes of coloniality, white supremacy must fall.
Yes, and that's something that has brought us all together and is at the core of the special issue that we edited and that each of you contributed to. And I appreciate the ways in which you've synthesized your praxis on racial justice and freedom, which is reciprocity, reflexivity, recentering communities, and these opportunities for radically imagining, right? So like 4 R's that I'm that I heard in what you described here, that really are highlighted in the work of all of you, of Rama, Daniela, Leigh. And what's amazing for me is of the ways in which each of you are doing it within your own unique locations. I mean, we're all coordinating this gathering across time zones was a challenge, but it's what a gift that we are brought together to talk about these themes and these threads of how each of you are really engaging in that process of radical relationality, reciprocity with communities, right? Accountability that is centered on transformation, of critical reflexivity, of unsettling not only yourselves and your positionalities, but also that of the academy as well, of recentering community voices and experiences, such that you are not speaking for the community, but it's creating apertures and opportunities for communities to speak for themselves, and of radically imagining not only what the discipline can do, but what the academy as a whole can do, not just community psychology, right? But these machines of production of knowledge, right? That if we look at the history of these institutions of production of knowledge, were not meant for some of us to be a part of, and yet here we are, right? So additional reflections, Rama, Leigh, Daniela?
I think I just wanted to say as well, just I think look outside of community psychology, look outside of the academy. Something I've been really engaging with is just, you know, think about how we can sort of, well, you know, they already are, I was about to say legitimized, but they already are legitimate forms of knowledge. But, you know, things like creative practices and cultural practices that have so much value and in knowledge creation and meaning making, and bringing that as well into sort of the things that I've been doing, you know. So with the collective as well, you know, we're, you know, talking about how we can sort of bring together some of, you know, the stuff that I've been writing about, but as well bringing creative practices into that, and even drawing, you know, I've been drawing on poetry as an interpretive tool in my own thesis, and using that as a way to think through some of the things that I'm grappling with, and you know, and I think that's just so important. We have to sort of step outside of those bounds, and yeah, I think that's probably that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Look outside the discipline. Yes, there's so much there. Look outside of the academy. Critical race theory, feminist theory, so much there.
I wanted to add to that one thing that I wish someone would have explicitly told me starting out, even from when I was like 10, I wish someone would have just told me to be very reflexive in everything that I do, not just in the academy or in like a professional sense, just like all day, every day, and just really grow that muscle and have that threshold. I feel like I started really late, and I hope that a lot of young people are starting early on, because I think that's the only way that that's gonna change. Really thinking about who you are, how you contribute to harming or replicating, undoing or building or constructing, deconstructing, all of it. And I think that that's something that we have to do all day, every day, and revisit our privileges or revisit who we are in everything that we do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just echo everything that everyone has said. And I think for those who are watching or participating in the session outside of the 4 of us or the 5 of us, you know, who are white or who identify as white, just having a lot of humility in this work and understanding that, you know, it's not about being perfect or, you know, there's going to be times where you will mess up, where you will get it wrong, but that reflexive piece around always being reflective of who you are and how you're showing up in this work, I think, yeah, is kind of the first step to being able to analyze those power structures that Anne-Marie was talking about, and yeah, just dismantle white supremacy, and always working towards that, I think, is so important in our field and beyond in our work with communities. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the wisdom that each of you have offered, and in light of the necessity and the urgency to be reflexive, to look beyond the discipline, and to unsettle. And in the words of Santosh Pillai, who wrote this really great piece on decolonizing psychology, creating cracks. The title of this article is called "Cracking the Fortress. Can we really decolonize psychology?" And so there's a quote in this piece by Santosh Pillai from 2017 that says, and I quote, "Drawing on Holloway's metaphor of cracks in a vulnerable, problematic system, Cornish and colleagues note that, quote, the metaphor serves as signifier of small spaces and everyday acts of resistance, the small cracks that cumulatively produce the crumbling of seemingly impenetrable edifices of power. This is a paradigmatic theory of change, relying on our willingness and ability to amplify short-term resistances and do things differently, widen the cracks, so that the fortress held by people, places, and practices can no longer be sustained." And so it seems to me that each of you are engaging in various acts of resistance that are cracking the hegemonic fortress of coloniality and power, and of whiteness and white supremacy and structures of racialization. So it has been my honor to be a part of this conversation, to learn so much from your work, and to see the threads in your work and the discipline expand and build towards this more capacious racial racial freedom, racial justice, more humanizing direction. So with that, I conclude, and I thank you all for this conversation. And I thank those that have joined us. My gratitude to all of you. And I hope that this gathering, that this video, that this conversation is one to be had time and time again, not only virtually, but in person and within the spaces that we occupy, that we're a part of. So thank you.